Chapter 47. "Your choices have left us short on time," said the man, sitting cross-legged at the center of the tent. "Come closer, quickly." It was dark inside, except for the man, the seer, Petrick guessed. He was gold. His skin was so golden it seemed to glow, and as Petrick ambled toward him, he realized it wasn't just a trick of the eye. His skin actually glowed the same glittering yellow color, and it lit up the ground around him and the tent's poles. He was old, older than any man Petrick had ever seen, and he was small, no larger than Petrick himself. His skin was cracked like sun-baked mud on a floodplain. He sat directly on the floor, his legs hugged up tight against his chest. As Petrick reached the seer, the old man bent down and reached into a small bowl at his feet. He brought up between his fingers a pinch of glowing gold dust. He lifted it on a fingertip to his nose, and he snorted loudly. The seer convulsed with the whole of his body after the gold dust disappeared inside him, and Petrick swore the old man glowed brighter. His eyes glazed over and he slumped forward. Was that starstuff he just inhaled? "Please, son of the Seeker," said the seer after he regathered himself and reopened his shining eyes to gaze at Petrick. "We have enough time for you to sit." Petrick sat in front of the glowing man. He heard the rest of the group shuffle into place behind him, quiet, finally. Thank you." With surprising quickness, the seer thrust an arm out toward him and was pressing something cold and hard against his forehead. An electric shock ran through Petrick, starting from whatever the seer was pressing to his skin, rippling towards the back of his head, down his spine, and from there out his extremities. Petrick gasped, and he was vaguely aware of cries of alarm, but his mind was transported elsewhere in an instant. Vague images ripped through his mind so quickly they were little more than blurs of motion, an explosion, his father's face, Susie's, an overwhelming feeling of sadness and loneliness, the color red everywhere. And then the object to his forehead was gone, and the seer was holding it in his hands. Before the seer's fingers closed over it, Petrick saw a jewel-like polished rock, golden in color and glowing, just like the seer. "What do you think you're doing, mister?" Susie said from behind Petrick. He could hear her struggling against Panzer. "I'm okay," Petrick wheezed, transfixed by the object in the seer's hands. Its glowing light showed between the old man's cracked fingers. "What was that?" The seer found Petrick's eyes and locked with them. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. "I do not have time to explain, son of the Seeker." You're calling him son of the Seeker," Haber said, speaking up. "Do you mean Fenton, the scientist? We were told he came here years ago to track down the source." "He did come here," the seer said, not taking his eyes off Petrick. "What did you tell him?" "That is known to us. The source is protected by the hornet's nest." The word hornet's nest hit Petrick like another shock to his forehead, and he bent over in pain. Haber put a worried hand out to catch him, should he slump to the floor. A vision of the swirling mass of gas and protoplanet from the new dream swam in his mind, overlaid with the nightly hornets that he'd seen so many times before they swarmed over his father's face. "But that is not why we are here," the seer continued. "Is it, son of the Seeker?" Petrick's heart began to pound. The seer had never taken his gaze off him. "Can you explain what the hornet's nest—" Haber was cut off mid-sentence by a gesture from the seer. He leaned forward, close to Petrick, and narrowed his eyes. "We wish to give you something else," he said. With his free hand, he reached behind his back and brought out another object, round and metallic, with a chain dangling from it. He took the glowing stone in his other hand and pressed it into the new object. The stone fit neatly into some sort of compartment. There was a click sound as the glowing stone was covered inside. Suddenly, the seer was holding onto Petrick's forearm and dropping the new metal object into his hand. Petrick pulled his hand back to try to look at whatever this new thing was, but the seer wouldn't let go. You need to stop touching my friend, Susie yelled at him, wrestling again against Panzer. But Petrick couldn't muster the attention to tell her to stand down. The seer captivated him. He looked sorrowful, pained, and he spoke again. It was intended to affirm you are on the right path, Petrick, but now I fear it is meant to lead you back to it. Heed its words, and remember. He pulled Petrick even closer to him and spoke again. This time his lips did not move. Remember. Outside, there was an explosion. The seer let Petrick go and turned his attention to Panzer, who was rushing over to the entrance of the tent. Have all not been evacuated? He asked her. Petrick opened his fingers and looked down at what the seer had given him. It was round, like a medallion. It was familiar. I kept behind a small garrison, Panzer called back in answer to the seer. For protection. The seer closed his eyes. That is unfortunate, he said. Petrick ran his fingers over an engraving at the top of the medallion, and recognition hit him like a lightning bolt as he realized what it read and where he'd seen it before. What is that? Barry asked, peering over his shoulder. Balta, Susie called to the pirate captain. That looks like your Starfarer's medallion. We must leave, Panzer called back to them. Her normally silky voice grated with panic. Another explosion boomed from outside, this time louder, closer. The medallion said, Never alone. It was the same one his father had shown him in the dream. His father's real medallion. A third explosion rocked the platform itself, and the seer was knocked over onto his side. He struggled to steady himself, and Haber rushed over to help the small old man. The seer waved him off. No, you must leave. You are a key variable in the coming probabilities. Now, Panzer shouted from the entrance of the tent. Barry and Susie pulled Petrick to his feet, but he couldn't take his eyes off the medallion in his hands. His heart was pounding. Never alone. Had he made a mistake? We have to leave, Petrick, Susie said into Petrick's ear. Her voice was so tiny, but so fierce, it pulled him back. His legs woke up, and he rose to follow everyone out of the tent. Panzer met them and directed them toward the tent entrance, then moved to go and fetch the seer. The old cracked man waved her off, too. Protect the many, he said to her gravely, not the one. Let him go. Panzer bellowed out some sort of Syrruk curse or guttural yell, and then left the seer behind. Balta was the first to reach the edge of the walkway outside and gazed down at the unfolding chaos below them. The pirate captain's eyes widened with fear, and she looked back at the group as they reached her a moment later. The Authority. How did they find us? Haber said, panic sharpening his voice. Come, said Panzer, leading them back across the narrow walkway toward the rock wall. The group didn't protest this time. They traversed the distance in a fraction of the time they'd taken across it before. They could see troops spilling from the entrance directly below them. They were all clothed in gray and white, and they looked just like ants. One large figure could be seen, even from the high vantage, taking point against a flurry of weapons fire that seemed to come from thin air. Behind that large figure, protected by the ring of fighters, was a smaller, hunched figure. Petrick recognized the two of them from Liberatia. One was Slink, and the other was the armored general from the marketplace. The Authority had found them indeed. As our group reached the rock wall, Petrick saw a flash of light from one of the soldiers, and a trail of smoke began to rise up toward them with astonishing speed. Too late, Petrick realized that it must be some kind of rocket-powered weapon, and it slammed into the narrow bridge where they'd just been walking. It exploded, and the bridge cracked, and then began to fall in slow motion. The seer's platform and his tent began to crumple with it. No! Bellowed Petrick with a scream that shook his entire body, but there was nothing he could do but watch it fall with the seer inside. This, too, is my fault, he thought. It crashed to the floor of the cavern with a mighty ground-shaking thud, and a plume of dust and smoke billowed out from it. Then, suddenly, Petrick was holding Susie's hand, and a gloved hand, and their group was hurtling toward the troops on the cavern floor. Panzer was flying them downward. As they neared the floor and the fighting, Petrick could now see it was between Authority troops and her guard garrison, who only popped into view for brief moments to fire and then disappeared once more. Panzer was flying them directly over the Authority contingent, who were pinned on the entrance ledge. The fighters did not see them coming from directly above. Panzer locked eyes with Petrick as she brought them dangerously low and close. She then slowed. "Watch it!" Balta called to Panzer. They were so close that her voice caught the attention of the hunched man, Slink, in the center of the troops. He searched for them through the chaos. Panzer took her eyes off Petrick and began to angle them away from the fighting, away from the Authority troops, out toward the field that lay just beyond the ledge. Petrick pulled his hand from the gloved Syrruk in one quick motion, and he dropped from the group, losing his lift. "Petrick!" Susie called to him, eyes wide. "You're slipping! Panzer, you need to get him back!" Panzer was trying, but to reach the boy, Petrick would have had to meet her halfway. He was dangling too far below the rest of the group now for her to grab him on her own. Petrick looked up at Susie, and then at Barry and Haber and Balta. Shame filled his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said to them. He didn't lift his hand up to the outstretched Panzer. Instead, he started to wiggle his other hand free from Susie's small clutches. "Stop!" Susie was holding on so tight that her knuckles went white. "What are you doing?" "I have to protect you." He finally freed his hand. He dropped to the ground just 10 feet below, tumbling right at Slink's feet. Slink smiled. Panzer quickly grabbed Susie's hand and hastened their pace away from the fallen Petrick. The shooting from the Authority troops behind them had stopped momentarily. Balta, too, started thrashing so hard she looked like she was having a conniption fit. "Go back!" she yelled at the Syrruk host. "I must take you to safety," she responded directly into their ears. "The seer said protect the many, not the one. He said to let him go." "Let him go, my ass," Balta said. "We're not leaving that kid with them." And she heaved her hand loose, breaking the other side of the chain. They, too, tumbled to the ground as Petrick had, but they were a good 300 feet now from the entrance of the hangar. The grass of the cavern floor made for a soft landing, and all of them sprang to their feet, unarmed. The air this low was now filled with dust and smoke from the seer's fallen platform and the weapons fire. Susie looked around immediately to make sure Clark was okay. It took her a moment to realize that the dog was with Petrick. "He has Clark," she said, a chilly realization running down her spine. "Why did he let go?" Barry asked, desperately searching his friends' faces. A series of weapons explosions at the entrance of the cavern drowned out the questions. The Authority troops were laying down covering fire as they retreated into the corridor that led back to the hangar bay. They had what they wanted, and they were leaving with him. Panzer crouched in front of her charges, shielding the group from the heat, blinding flashes, and bits of rock and dust that were kicked up. After it had settled, Panzer stood, catching sight of one lone figure left behind the retreating Authority troops. "Is that Petrick?" Susie shouted, peeking around their protector. It wasn't Petrick. Panzer knew who it was. "You!" she shouted, raising her staff. It took Susie a moment to look through the haze, but Panzer and the other armored figure looked almost exactly the same. Where Panzer was in all black, the other was in reds and golds. But they were the same height, the same build, they even moved the same. The other figure did not answer. Panzer whipped the jeweled staff around her head, and when it came back full circle to face the figure on the platform, a streak of crackling white energy shot out. The figure merely stepped aside, as if it knew it was coming. A flurry of other weapons fire, which must have been from Panzer's garrison, rained down on the figure a moment later. Flashes of the garrison became visible for split seconds as they fired, then disappeared again. They seemed to be everywhere. This time, the figure had to twist, jump, roll, and contort itself, but every bolt of energy was dodged before it reached its intended target. The figure knew what was coming. The flurry of fire stopped. The figure stood again on the platform, wordlessly impervious. It stared at Panzer. Through the helmet slit, Susie imagined Panzer was glaring fiercely in return. "Give him back!" Susie shouted. The figure turned its gaze to look at her, and Balta grabbed Susie by the mouth and tried with futility to wrestle her behind Panzer's protective stance. But Susie wasn't going to take her eyes away from that figure. The figure looked at the petulant child for a moment, seemed to gather itself, and then spun off 7 shots from its armored arms in the time it took Susie to blink her eyes. 7 figures in black armor fell from thin air and thudded to the ground, dead. All 7 of Panzer's guards. In an instant. The figure on the platform then turned away and disappeared into the corridor, back to the hangar bay. Panzer bellowed in rage and took off running after it. "Wait!" Haber called after her, but it was too late. Panzer flew to the ledge with a single bounding step, and then she too was gone from the cavern, having abandoned her charges. "I don't understand," said Haber. "How could the Authority possibly have known we were here?" "We have to go after Petrick," said Susie. Her eyes were wild. Balta nodded. "That stupid kid," she said, picking herself up from the ground. She set the pace, running back to the entrance, the rest of the group running behind her. "I knew he was going through some stuff, but I didn't peg him as capable of doing something like this." "You believe it was Petrick who led the Authority here?" Haber asked incredulously. "He took Clark with him," Susie said, hot, angry tears filling her face, as well as Barry's, as it began to sink in what had just happened. Petrick had taken the dog. He didn't mean to come back. "Listen, none of that matters now," said Balta, breaking off in a full sprint, with the rest of them racing to keep up with her. "We have to catch up with those cronies." "We're going to get him back, right?" Barry said, trying his best not to panic. "Not if we don't hurry," Balta barked in response. Gotta pause at the scene break here and take a sip. They reached the ritual cleansing room to find it blown wide open. The Authority were certainly not ones for subtlety, but that was all the better as far as Balta was concerned. It was deserted, as was the long corridor. No sign of Authority troops. They had a shot straight back to the hangar. "Move it!" she shouted, sprinting into the corridor. The heavy woman could move when she wanted to, and so could the children. They were running so fast they nearly overshot the door to the hangar bay. Weapons fire booming beyond it saved them in that regard. They stepped up to the door, looking hopelessly for a control panel, but it blessedly slid open on its own, with a rock-on-rock grinding. Balta shielded her eyes and blocked the children and Haber from stepping through as the flashes of energy discharge nearly blinded her. A large, boxy, and utilitarian ship with an exterior of pure shiny white sat in the middle of the hangar, an Authority transport. The transport's gangplank was resting on the floor of the hangar like a tongue. Troops were stationed at its base, ringed around it. The Red Robert sat tucked off to the side where Balta had left it, hopefully undamaged. The firefight was concentrating in the other direction, between the transport and the few remaining Syrruk ships. Someone was giving the Authority hell. It took Balta only a moment to realize it was Panzer. Balta reached for her pistols, but it was clear they were too late to help the Syrruk woman. They had arrived just in time to watch an angry bolt of energy strike Panzer right in the chest. It flung her skittering to the far side of the hangar. She lay there and did not get up. The other armored figure, who had shot the decisive blow, watched Panzer's motionless form for a moment, then signaled its troops to retreat into the ship. They disappeared into its holding bay, and with a clunk and a whine, the gangplank started to lift up. "Hey!" Balta shouted to the retreating force. They hadn't seen her before, much to our group's fortune, it would seem, given what had just happened to Panzer. Susie clawed around the barring Balta to get a look at what was going on. She zeroed in instantly on the center of the holding bay, right at the edge of the gangplank. Just before it finished closing, Susie caught sight of Petrick standing next to the horrid-looking wasp of a man whose hand was placed firmly on the boy's shoulder. Petrick locked eyes with her for a brief moment before the gangplank sealed shut. "Petrick, don't leave!" she screamed. But the gangplank solidly, undeniably shut. The Authority ship fired its thrusters and it lifted off. It turned its nose toward the hangar doors, and it was gone. He was gone. That's the end of chapter 47. Chapter 48. Balta threw herself into her seat in the Red Robert's cockpit and furiously flipped switches on the console. Colossus had the ship primed and ready to leave almost as soon as they had all hurriedly entered. Susie was wailing, only able to walk because Barry was holding her up. Haber took a position behind the captain. "Let's go!" Balta shouted to Colossus, and they all felt the ship shudder as its boosters fired to take them out of the still-open hangar doors. A moment later, they were out in space, and space was dominated by the terrifying sight of the capital ship, gleaming from its running lights. The transport ship they were chasing was heading right for it. "Perhaps it is unwise to—" Haber started before Balta cut him off. "Can it, Tin Man," she said. "We're going to get him back." Haber didn't respond. Balta was right. What else could they do? The risk of getting caught by the giant ship be damned. Susie sobbed something to Barry, but he couldn't understand her. He just continued to hold her. He thought of all the times she had held him, as he did now for her. She'd always kept her eyes dry and her head up. He would do the same. "It's going to be okay," he said to her. "It's going to be okay, Suze. We're going to get him back." Balta was thinking Petrick had purposefully fallen right into the enemy's hands. The little bastard hadn't been surprised they'd been found. He looked like he'd known. The shifty Syrruk, for that matter, seemed to have known too. What with all their rushing of them to see the seer and the "we don't have time," it made her head split in pain just thinking of the swirling questions. "We are going to get him?" Barry asked her. "Right?" Balta didn't answer. She just gritted her teeth as she watched the transport ship glide into a hangar bay on the capital ship. "We have to get there before they engage their drive," she said, sweat starting to bead on her forehead. She turned to Colossus. "Fire a rocket on their starboard side. Lower third quadrant should be right." Colossus obliged without a word, and there was a pop sound as a missile sped away from their ship toward the capital ship. "We have weapons," Haber said. "Pirate ship has to have some teeth," Balta answered. "Maybe we can knock it out with one lucky shot." Balta knew she was hoping against hope. It was written on her face. The hope was in vain. The missile's target wasn't there when it finally arrived. The capital ship had flashed brilliantly in gold, and it was gone, traveling into the dark sky at speeds faster than that of light itself. Balta screamed a few curse words and banged on her console before punching up her own star drive. "Hang on," she said a moment before the Red Robert lurched beyond the light speed barrier as well. It nearly knocked Barry off his feet, but he stood his ground. Ahead of them, the heads-up cockpit displayed the capital ship as a tiny dot ahead of them, but not completely out of sight. They still had a chance. They could see their quarry. "Come on, baby," Balta said, stroking the Red Robert for a little more speed. Barry held out hope that this rust bucket could maybe catch up. And if only they could catch up, maybe then they could do something. Petrick wouldn't be gone. But just when it seemed like they might, the ship around them exploded. If one had been floating in just the right location outside of Syrruk space, one would have seen an old model cargo-class ship come hurtling out of faster than light, with a cough of golden color, and spin wildly, end over end, as the drive imploded. It was a chain reaction to the drive engaging at the moment the supply of Starstuff ran dry, and the vessel was pulled violently back into normal space, where the rules of light and physics applied. One also would have seen fractures shatter the old vessel. White wisps of atmosphere hissed through the cracks, and chunks of metal, wiring, and personal belongings began to spread out in a debris cloud. One would have been very concerned for those poor air-breathing souls who were inside. Very concerned indeed. Slink brought Petrick up to the command deck, Plata at his side. Neither had said a word to Petrick the entire time, nor had he felt remotely inclined to make conversation with the slimy man or the behemoth of a woman. And she was a woman. Petrick had heard her called General Plata. Slink had left his hand possessively on Petrick's shoulder from the moment he let himself fall to the ground at his feet. The message that Petrick had sent to the authority, the message he hadn't been sure it had gone through on the Red Robert's dilapidated communications equipment, had apparently been received and his conditions accepted. They'd leave his friends alone. The capital ship had arrived to snatch him up even faster than he'd calculated. The authority seemed, if nothing else, to be efficient. One had to be, he supposed, when you were keeping the entirety of human civilization under your boot heel. "A ship pursues," a voice called out from one of the dozens of posts on the command deck. "Shall we apprehend?" The voice was addressing Slink, who turned to the appropriate display screen. It snapped on, and with a sinking feeling in his stomach, Petrick fought the urge to burst into tears. It was the Red Robert. All of this would be in vain were they to catch up, or if the capital ship slowed to meet them. "Slow to," Slink began in a raspy, grating voice. "No!" Petrick shouted. "Leave them alone. That was the deal." Slink looked down at Petrick with cold eyes, and Petrick knew he didn't care. Slink was about to speak again to order the capture of Petrick's loved ones anyway, the deal be damned, when another voice spoke out from behind them. It was a voice Petrick knew immediately, and it carried an authority with it that Slink's voice never could. "The boy is right," it said. "That was the deal." Slink released his hand from Petrick's shoulder. "Let the ship go and continue on our course," the voice said. Petrick turned slowly, both an undeniable excitement and uncontrollable dread filling up his chest and his throat. He laid eyes upon the tall, broad man who stood before him. "Dad?" Petrick said. "Hello, Petrick," answered Fenton of Indikar, master purveyor of the authority. And that is the end of Starstuff. Book 1 in the Starstuff trilogy. A cliffhanger ending, to be sure, but it is only the first part of a three-part story. Three-part story that might turn into four-part story, which is a perfect segue into talking just for a moment briefly about the second book, which I am still writing. It is not out yet. It's getting close. I don't know exactly when it'll be out, but I am literally working on that book every day, and it is getting close. I'm very, very close, and book 2 might actually turn into 2 books, and then we'll see what happens with the last part of the story. But I'm definitely early on in my author journey. This is the first book that I've written and published. So I'm still learning a lot, and one of the things that I'm learning about is that I definitely over outline, and by that I mean I write an outline for what I think is going to be one book. This was actually supposed to be a standalone when I first started writing it. Clearly, that outline that I thought was one book is turned into 3, maybe more. So I'm definitely finding that continuing to be true. I pack in a lot. So anyway, the second book will be out sometime soon, I promise. Working my butt off on it. So if you're excited about reading the next one, it's coming. Thank you guys. It's crazy. It's just crazy to think that we're all the way through the book. It seems like it went by in a blur. And I'm definitely sad that I'm not going to be doing this every day now. I'll have to finish the next book, so that I can read that one too. But thank you so much for watching and listening, or however it is that you are joining me on what has been an amazing journey. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I don't get to say same time, same place tomorrow because we're done. So instead, I will just, again, say thank you so much for doing this to me. I really, really, really hope that you enjoyed it. If you're looking forward to the next book, hop on over to my website, iraheineken.com. Or iraheineken.com, and if you don't know how to spell my name or don't want to like copy and paste it, you can spell it like the beer, iraheineken.com. That near miss will forward to my website, or this one's really easy to remember. I got the domain ira.com, so ira.com, all spelled out, .com, and that will forward to my website. But I have a form there where you can sign up for my mailing list. And you'll automatically be notified when book 2 comes out. So if you enjoyed this and you're looking forward to book 2, please do that. That would be amazing. And that's it, you guys. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on this. It's been a blast. I will see all of you guys again sometime soon. Bye now, everybody.